Chris Kurt Jaros, and I have a speaking and teaching ministry called Veracity Hill. I wear a number of different hats. I'm also the director of marketing for Rock Show Christie, and I'm an affiliate faculty member at Colorado Christian University. So if this conference has, again, been edifying to you, check out that table. Sign up if you want to learn more about the program. We'd love to have you. If you want to study under me, I'm mainly in the grad program. I have taught a couple undergrad courses, but yeah, so great program there. Check out the table. All right, so you've come here to learn about how we can know the Bible is true. And we are living in an ever-increasing secular society, and relativism is domineering. So that's true for you, but not for me. And so these sort of relative norms. And we really want to know if the Bible, as a historical collection of books, corresponds with reality, if it really happened. Of course, if it really happened, that has implications for how we live our lives. And as we may see, I mean, eventually that's what it comes down to for some people and their philosophical assumptions. It's because they know they have to start acting a certain way in a Christian manner. They have to stop doing those things that they enjoy doing. So that's what it comes down to. All right, so like any good sermon, even though this is going to be longer than a traditional sermon, I've got 3 points, okay? How many of you can recognize this image? Do you know where it's from? I heard Loki, yes. Okay, so if you've seen Loki, hang on one moment here. When in Rome. Okay, no, actually Dr. Pepper's my favorite beverage. So let's get a close-up on that. Yeah, sure. Okay, I can smile if you want. Okay, so this is Loki, and the villain in the Loki TV show, here, he was being quite serious. His filter's on.
I do not take, I always take it.
Let me know when you're ready. The villain in Loki is the TVA, or the Time Variance Authority. It's about time travel and whatnot. Okay, there he is. Okay. Make sure you get that to Eric.
That's a new profile picture.
There you go. Yeah. All right, so the TVA. So if you can remember Loki and the main villain there, you can remember the 3 points here today. Transmission of the text, veracity of the documents, and the accounts of eyewitnesses. So let's start first with the transmission of the text. So remember this year, 1947. Before 1947, the oldest manuscript evidence of the Old Testament that we had were a Greek Septuagint fragment dating to the 2nd century BC, the Samaritan Pentateuch, and the Nash Papyrus, which only dates to about 1000, AD 1000. But in 1947, this was a good year for biblical archaeology, the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered in the Qumran community in Israel. And the Dead Sea Scrolls are roughly 950 manuscripts that were discovered of the Hebrew Bible. Everything except for Esther. And it dates, here's why it's significant, it dates to as early as the 3rd century BC. So why is this important? Well, it became the earliest manuscript evidence that we have of the Old Testament, but also it provided us an early date for example, the book of Isaiah. Now, how many of you have heard of Isaiah 53 as a prophecy pertaining to Christian belief? Okay, a few of you. So Isaiah 53, that basically the Messiah would come and would be crucified, right? So a number of liberal theologians have said, oh, boy, that sounds like Jesus. It must have been written after Jesus lived. Okay, well, yeah. So with the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls in 1947, they had to shift their views that Isaiah was written before Jesus lived. We now had hard evidence that this biblical prophecy was written before Jesus existed. Okay, so they had to shift their views. We're going to see that come up a little later as well. An additional discovery was made in 1979 of what is now the oldest surviving biblical text that we have, and it comes from the Katif Hanam amulet, or what's sometimes called the Silver Scrolls of the Aaronic benediction. So that's Numbers 6:24-25, and it dates to the mid-7th or 6th century BC. Again, making them the oldest known biblical text that we have. All right. Now, the Old Testament for some guys, especially some big nerds, is exciting, thrilling. For others, it's kind of dull, dry. You know, it's like Leviticus. You just have to wait. You gotta wade through it, right? So I'm going to just do a magic show to start here. Just maybe spice things up. I'm going to become the most powerful magician you've met, at least today. I might be the only magician you've met today. I'm going to cause some Bible verses to disappear. Okay? So raise your hand if you brought a Bible in here, or if you have a digital Bible. Yeah, a smartphone, good. Does anyone have a King James Version or a New King James Version on them? Yeah. We do, yes. How many? How many? Okay. Oh, wow, a number of you have the KJV. Okay, so here, I need a volunteer. Look up this verse. There we go. Matthew 17:21. Who wants it? Raise your hand if you want it. Matthew 7. Oh, down here in front. Matthew 17:21. It could be KJV or NKJV. I'm a little specific as a magician. And I'm going to undo my sleeves here so you can see I've got nothing here, okay? Matthew 17:21 is the verse. Go ahead, out loud.
Howbeit this kind goeth not out but by prayer and fasting.
Okay, some words of Jesus. Very common, easy verse to select. I'm going to recite a Latin incantation here. And if anybody guesses this incantation, they'll get brownie points with me. Credo in unum Deum, patrum omnipotentatem, factorum cali et terra, visibilium, omnium, et invisibilium. Disappearing verse. Does someone have an NIV or ESV on them? Yes, could you look up Matthew 17:21? Da 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 da. It's not there. So we've made the verse disappear. Okay, let's take another. Luke 17:36 in the KJV or NKJV. Who's up next? Someone from the left side, my left side. In back, yes. 17:36.
It says, 2 men shall be in the field, and one shall be taken, and the other left.
Okay. More words of Jesus. All right. And anyone have an NIV or ESV? Oh, wait, before we do that. Credo in unum Deum, patrum omnipotentatem, factorum cali et terra, visibilium omnium et invisibilium. Okay, over there. Not there. Okay, the incantation works. Let's take a third and final verse to disappear. Here, 1 John 5:7. It could be 8a. There's a little bit of 8 that's left over. KJV or NKJV. Anyone want to give that a read? 1 John 5:7. By the way, this isn't a real incantation, so I hope we didn't just research that.
There are 3 that bear witness in heaven, the Father, the Word, and the Holy Spirit. And these 3 are one. And there are 3 that bear witness on earth, the Spirit, the water, and the blood. And these 3 agree as one.
Okay. One last time. Credo in unum Deum, patrum omnipotentatem, factorum cali et terrae, visibilium omnium et invisibilium. It's gone out of your Bibles if you have an ESV, NIV, or a few others. Could someone from the NIV give it a try here? Do you have it? NIV.
Yes, I have it.
You have 1 John 5:7, verse 7.
For there are 3 that testify, the Spirit, the
Oh, that's
water.
not the NIV.
Okay. I'm sorry.
Any? 1 John 5:7. There we go. It's not there. That's right. It skips verses.
But why?
But why, you may ask? Okay, well, so a good magician. What? Don't be revealing secrets. Only the magician can reveal the secrets. Okay, here we go. Magic's greatest secrets revealed. I may have been the greatest magician you've met today, but I will reveal the secret. So, why aren't those verses there? So perhaps I've piqued your interest. Now raise your hand if I've piqued your interest. Did you know about these missing verses? Maybe not. So the reason why these verses are missing is because they do not appear in the earliest manuscripts. Okay, so when we're thinking about transmission, those verses were later added, scholars have come to believe. So scholars have ways of categorizing the manuscripts that we discover. And they're frequently broken down into 4, sometimes 3 different families. We could really go to school if you wanted me to write these out, but I'll say them first. The first family is the Alexandrian family. And the Alexandrian family is the oldest set of manuscripts. The second family is the Western text type, which has the Old Latin and a Syriac version of the scriptures. The third is the Caesarean, Caesarean is for women, the Caesarean, and a minority group of scholars think it belongs in the Western family there. That's why sometimes there's debate over 4 or 3. And lastly, what's that? Caesarean, like Caesarea Philippi. Fourth, the Byzantine family, okay? And the Byzantine family of manuscripts is what the New King James Version and the New King James and a few others base their English editions off of, okay? It wouldn't be appropriate to refer to it as an English translation. They are all English translations. But the reason why there are different editions is because the competing philosophies over how to best translate the scriptures. And these editorial groups use these families. So where it doesn't include a verse or there's an editorial note, as we heard, so sometimes that's the case. For example, the woman caught in adultery in John's Gospel. Believe it or not, even though it sounds like something Jesus would do, it's not in the earliest manuscripts. So frequently there's a little note saying it doesn't appear there. Same thing with the last half of the last chapter of Mark. The same concept there. So that's why in some Bibles you're going to see verses missing. Okay, let's get back. So that was the magic show. Thank you very much. Okay, so let's get back here to the New Testament, looking at examples of the transmission of the text. I want to start with the New Testament regarding copies. There are roughly about 4,000 known manuscripts of the Bible, or parts of the Bible, made between the 2nd and 15th centuries. In particular, there are 3 codices that John Warwick Montgomery considers to be the greatest literary treasures to Christendom. Okay? And they are these 3: Codex Sinaiticus, Codex Vaticanus, and Codex Alexandrinus. And if you think that this is the stuff that only scholars get to see, I've got news for you. If you want to go to London, England, you can go see with your own eyes Codex Sinaiticus and Codex Alexandrinus at the British Library. There's the British Museum, which has a lot of great, cool, fun artifacts. But if you want to see those, you go to the British Library. All right. How many of you have done that before? Have you seen the manuscripts? I'm the only one.
Nope,
Oh, there's a hand over there. Yes, down in the corner. Wonderful.
Oh.
There is a hand in the corner. Okay. So you can go to London. So next time you're planning a vacation, do that. Go see it. It's a great opportunity. So there are also numerous fragments of papyri. We're going to look at a few of those. And so next, so these are like complete manuscripts. You'll notice a later date, 4th century, 5th century, so 300s and 400s. But we have fragments even earlier. I'm going to tell it. No, I think we're everyone okay temperature-wise? Warm.
Hot.
Open it. Open it.
Very, very hot.
Although now I can't. So did that. So the John Rylands papyrus, okay, this is the oldest known New Testament manuscript. And it preserves John 18, 31 to 33. And on the back side, verses 37 to 38. Oh, by the way, for those of you over here, I forgot to mention the QR code on the top. If you're having trouble seeing the screen, just scan it with your phone and you'll get my PowerPoint slides on your phone. Any of you can do that. So if you're like driving home or something, well, don't be looking at the slides and driving. If you're a passenger and you want to review. So the John Rylands papyrus, P52. So P stands for Papyrus. Okay, this is the way of organizing manuscripts, and they're given numbers. The John Rylance papyrus is about the size of my hotel key card. Okay, so front and back, and it dates. Here's where the theologically liberal scholars had to shift their views again. John's gospel, they argued, came in the late 2nd and 3rd century. Okay, so of course, if we think that John was an eyewitness, well, wait a second. If this is dated to late 2nd and 3rd century, it couldn't have been an eyewitness. Well, with the discovery of the John Rylance papyrus, it dates to as late as and no later than 130 A.D. It could be earlier. So this is the earliest biblical manuscript that we have. You can go see it at the University of Manchester, where it's clearly well photographed. That's a nice quality photograph there. Straight from the credit goes to the Rylance Society. I think that's the company that documents it. So again, that's the earliest we have. And it's forced the theological liberal scholars to change their views now on the dating of the 4th gospel. Some would say early 2nd century now. Some say 1st century. And 1st century is, of course, in alignment with what evangelical Christians had believed for a very long time. Okay, we have another collection of papyri. Closing up here, this is the last section of the New Testament. The Chester Beatty papyri, 11 papyri announced in 1931, dated to the 2nd and 3rd centuries. So this is not complete manuscripts, but it's earlier than those other codices. And the Bodmer papyri collection, 22 papyri discovered in 1952, and it's dated to around circa 200 AD. This is enough. Those documents alone are enough to compile all of Luke, John, Romans, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, Galatians, Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians, 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, and Hebrews. And portions of the rest of them. Okay, so you can get really darn close to a complete New Testament from those fragments alone, dating to the 2nd and 3rd centuries. That's some great material. Let's compare how great of material. Since we opened the door. Okay, that chart's going to be a little hard to see, but when we compare the biblical manuscript tradition with non-Christian material, Plato, Homer, Thucydides, Julius Caesar, Tacitus, we can see that the biblical literature far and away is superior in all regards. It's a shorter gap in time from the time it was written to the earliest manuscripts we have. Okay, for others it could be, as you can see from the chart, hundreds of years. And yet historians have no problem with thinking that what we have today was what they wrote back then. So the gap is a lot shorter for Christian literature. But what I really want you to note here are the number of manuscripts. And here's why I want you to note this. For some ancient writers, we have a mere tens, maybe in the hundreds of copies of manuscripts for something. With the New Testament, we have more than 5,000 copies of the New Testament. And that's important because if you wanted to see if there were any errors, the more manuscripts you have, the higher level of confidence, like exponentially, you could become confident that that's what they wrote back then. Because you'd be able to see how frequently an error creeps in and how it may have just been a one-time thing or if the error persisted. So you can analyze more. It's more data, right? And with more data, we can gain more confidence. So the fact that we have so many more copies than anything else from antiquity is very strong evidence. So even though many people want to place the Christian documents on a higher standard or a double standard, if you will, we can still meet that standard. So here's the bottom line on transmission. It must have been the incantation. By the way, any guesses on what that Latin phrase was?
Something to do with disappear the facts.
Not quite.
Not quite.
I believe in God Almighty, maker of heaven and earth.
Got it.
What was visible has now become invisible.
Close, yeah. So it's not the Apostles' Creed, it's the start of the Nicene Creed. Of all things made visible and invisible. So I selected that because I would get it visible, invisible. So it's the start of the Nicene Creed, okay? One of our very beloved Christian creeds. All right, the bottom line on transmission, before moving into our other points, is that although textual variants, which is a change from one manuscript to another, are important to talk about, it's inaccurate to suggest that they would cause a reasonable doubt upon whether we could be certain about what the New Testament said. And even Bart Ehrman, who is a non-Christian New Testament scholar, he says this: in spite of these remarkable differences, scholars are convinced that we can reconstruct the original words of the New Testament with reasonable, though probably not 100% accuracy. All right, so even he says we can, with reliable certainty, know what the New Testament said. Now, he's frequently made out to be a boogeyman. If you've ever heard some other apologists talk about Bart Ehrman, they might paint him as this bad guy, a Darth Vader type. And fair enough, Ehrman's not a Christian. A number of the things he's said do not align with what we Christians believe. But on the transmission of the text here, he wrote a book called Misquoting Jesus in 2005. It became a New York Times bestseller. And I think Christians have done a poor job on talking about that book. I think what Ehrman wrote in that book isn't all that controversial. And there are some evangelical scholars who think as much, but there are a lot of popular folks who kind of give Ehrman a bad name for that content. So I put out a 6-part video series. It's on DVD at the Veracity Hill table. And this series caught Ehrman's attention. And he invited me to come. He posted all 6 videos at his website and invited me to come talk with atheists and non-believers at his site about the material. It was a good ministry opportunity, a witnessing opportunity to folks outside of our belief system. So yeah, more on that at my table if you want to come see me afterward. Okay, so it's one thing to say that the biblical text has been transmitted reliably through the centuries, but it doesn't mean it's true. It could all be false. It could be like, hey, let's make copies of Lord of the Rings, right? So you can have a reliable text of the Lord of the Rings written by Tolkien. It doesn't mean it's true. So it's another thing to look at the veracity of the documents. Veracity, habitual truthfulness. That when the documents are presenting themselves with the facts, that lends to the conclusion that they are in fact reliable. Okay, so the first point here. So we've got 3 points, 3 subpoints here under veracity. Luke the historian, Paul's letters, and embarrassing details. How many of you like Wheel of Fortune? All right, what's one of the categories there? People, places, and things. So this is people, places, and events, okay? So what makes Luke a great historian are these 3 points. Luke was the travel companion of Paul, and he wrote his gospel and also the book of Acts. And in the first chapter of Luke, he specifically describes his intentions. He says, many have undertaken an attempt to write a narrative of the things that have transpired. But you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to make an orderly account. And sometimes that word orderly could be translated as a chronological account. Usually it's the translation that you have in English editions is orderly. But that's in contrast to, for example, Matthew and Mark, which are perhaps organized thematically with an additional chronology, but not as structured. So Luke says up front what his intentions are. He's writing an orderly account. So the people he mentions: Pontius Pilate, Herod the Great, Sergio Paulus, Gallus, Felix, Caiaphas, Ananias, Gamaliel. Luke's uses of titles is astoundingly accurate for that first century. In Acts 13:7, Sergio Paulus is proconsul. In Acts 16:18, there's an archon. Acts 16:35, praetors and lictors, for what we would call a magistrate or an officer. And finally, in his gospel, he refers to Herod Antipas as the tetrarch. Imagine you lived in 300, 400 AD, and you wanted to write about that Jesus guy. You wouldn't know what these titles were. And you may not be certain that these titles refer to these specific individuals. What we have with Luke, when he refers to these historical figures, is 100% accuracy. There's not a single person for whom he has mistitled in his 2 books. And it's really led a number of scholars to realize just how strong of a historian Luke was. Places. Luke lists 32 countries, 54 cities, and 9 islands without a single mistake. Events. I'll just give one example of many. the Jews were expelled from Rome. In Acts 18:2, we are told. Well, this is corroborated from an ancient historian named Suetonius in his work, Lives of the 12 Caesars, who wrote, since the Jews constantly made disturbances at the instigation of Chrestus, he expelled them from Rome. Now, Suetonius published that work in 121, and Luke's Acts of the Apostles is likely to have been written, I would say, prior to 70. Okay, so we have an extra biblical confirmation of the expulsion of the Jews from Rome. So time and again, Luke shows himself to be intimately familiar with people, places, and events. This is far and away different from, say, the Book of Mormon. The Book of Mormon, we haven't corroborated, I mean, generally speaking, folks have not been able to corroborate externally a single person, place, or event therein. So we're talking whole different ball games here, guys. It's not even like there's a mixture, it's on a spectrum. It's like black and white comparing those two documents. All right, let's get to Paul here. 2 points for Paul. So, Paul's letters have veracity in them. The letters that he wrote to different churches, frequently about the local troubles therein, included not only aspects of truthfulness, but the earliest Christian creeds. So aspects of truthfulness pertaining to the congregation, but early Christian creeds. That's important because that demonstrates that the creeds, the teachings of the early church, existed prior to Paul penning the letter. So even if you date a Pauline letter to mid to late 40s AD in that first century, to maybe in the 50s, the teaching that was passed along must have formed at an earlier date. And some scholars believe that 1 Corinthians 15, 3 through 8, is the earliest Christian creed. And Paul is explicit. He says that this was passed on to him. He passes it on also to them. So we don't have time to get into it, but it's a real great creed, and you should all look at it when you have a chance. So, authentic content. Okay? There are many things. If you were to write about a guy who's shepherding the early churches, if you had to make it up, there are things that you wouldn't put in there. So, for example, Galatians 6:11, Paul writes, "See with what large letters I'm writing to you with my own hand." That's just sort of a weird thing to say if you were making something up, right? It's something you wouldn't think of. Well, as it turns out, the more we've come to learn and discover about the first century, in the first century, it was extremely common to have a secretary draft the letter for you. Why? Well, because literacy rates weren't as high, and not just literacy, but writing. You had to be able to, maybe you could read, but you didn't know how to write. So you had to have someone write and draft it. So here Paul says he's writing these letters. Okay, so we see examples like that in Paul's letters, this authentic content. All right, let's move along to embarrassing details. All right, if you had to make up a story about this Jesus guy, maybe he wasn't a miracle worker, maybe that was all just legendary development. Let's suppose that actually happened, and so you're just crafting this material. You would not include embarrassing details. Why? Because you want people to believe that this is a persuasive thing. Embarrassing details make you look bad. So we're going to look at a few of those here. First, Jesus' family didn't believe him. They did not believe who he was. We're told this multiple times in the Gospels, more than those two instances. I just gave two there, but it appears more than those two verses. Also, John the Baptist, the guy who paves the way for the Messiah, sends his own messengers. Hey, are you the Messiah? Right? It's a little awkward, a little embarrassing. Women discover the tomb. In the first century, women's testimony was thrown out in a court of law. It wasn't even respected. So if you had to create a story about discovering the empty tomb, you would have written that men discovered the empty tomb because they're the ones who are reputable, right? But instead, what's the matter of the fact? Well, women discovered the empty tomb. Craig Keener, a New Testament scholar, writes, "The witness of women at the tomb is very likely historical, precisely because it was so offensive to the larger culture, not the sort of testimony one would invent." And lastly, Peter, the leader of the early church, is called Satan. Youch. Boy, hey, come join our movement. Oh yeah, the one guy who was in charge called this other guy who's now in charge Satan. You want to join something like that? Not really. So it's awkward, right? It's embarrassing. And so that lends credence to the idea that this is historical material. Okay, TBA, accounts of eyewitnesses. First, I want to talk about external, non-biblical evidence. So, this is evidence from the early church fathers on the authorship of the Gospels. We have the 4 Gospels. How do we know who wrote them? Looking outside of the Bible, we see that, especially a number of cases in Eusebius, but he's quoting from a church father, Papias, who was born in the second half of the 1st century and died in the first half of the 2nd century. So he's a fairly early church father. He wrote, Matthew wrote the oracles in the Hebrew language, and everyone interpreted them as he was able. What makes this interesting is that we're told Matthew wrote in the Hebrew language. Well, the manuscript tradition, I got some bad news. We don't have any Hebrew manuscripts of Matthew. Okay, so what's going on here? Well, this has led some scholars to posit, to put forward a theory, which I think there's good reason to hold, that Matthew had like a first edition, okay, where he is passing on the teachings of Jesus. And this comes in the sayings, for example, the Sermon on the Mount, right? The sayings of Jesus, the Logion. And what happens later on is Matthew discovers, hey, I maybe need to write a little bit more here about what's happening. One of the priorities of the early church was passing on church teachings, specifically the teachings of Jesus to believers. And later on, they realized maybe they needed to write down the works and miracles. So perhaps it's the case that with Matthew, his first edition was in Hebrew, and a second edition came later on in Greek. So also, Irenaeus mentions Matthew. Regarding the second gospel, we have Papias also saying that Mark, having become the interpreter of Peter, wrote down accurately, though not in order, whatsoever he remembered of the things said or done by Christ. So Papias notes here that Mark's gospel is not in order. Contrast that with Luke's gospel, orderly account. Mark's gospel, again, thematically organized. We have Irenaeus again also saying the same thing as much regarding Mark, that he was basically a follower and interpreter of Peter. Luke, Irenaeus and Tertullian mentions Luke as the author of the third gospel, and John, same thing, Irenaeus mentions John. So is this all important? Well, it's important in that we have external evidence of the authorship of the Gospels, and also that there are no other names associated with the Gospels. So it's not as if this were disputed in the early church. Those 4 guys were the guys who wrote the Gospels. Okay, but it's not in the manuscripts. Well, that's fair. In Greek manuscripts, when Paul wrote a letter, he'd say, hey, it's Paul. I'm writing a letter to you guys. Grace and peace. In the Gospels, we don't have something like that. But there should be a point that's made with the fact that in the manuscripts that have the titles, we have the names. The Gospel according to Matthew, the Gospel according to Mark, the Gospel according to Luke, the Gospel according to John. Now, some scholars aren't impressed with the titles. They may say, well, that was a later edition. Perhaps. Perhaps not. I mean, we don't have the autographer to compare it to. The autographer meaning the original, like an autograph. But it is, I think, still a small piece of valuable evidence. Okay, so let's just say that they are anonymous, okay? Does it really matter that they are anonymous? I don't think it does, and here's why. The value is in the content. You can look at the content alone and deduce an eyewitness or material from eyewitnesses. And that's what's important at the end of the day. Whether it's John who wrote the 4th gospel or Thomas who wrote the 4th gospel, it doesn't matter. But what matters is the content being valuable. Are they good sources? So yes, because they are eyewitnesses or 1 degree separated from the eyewitnesses, that makes it valuable. That makes it good. Sometimes with ancient Greco-Roman authors, they had no eyewitnesses, and they had to go off of other things that they were told secondhand. And yet we still take it, typically, not always, that what they say is accurate. So when we're looking at the Gospels, when we're looking at the internal biblical evidence, we're dealing with good sources. Okay. Now I want to spend some time talking about the argument from undesigned coincidences, or what I call a meta-internal biblical evidence. How many of you have heard of the argument from undesigned coincidences? Nobody. Yes, one hand?
Oh, no.
No. Sometimes introverts are just a little too shy. It's like, how many? Yeah, there's one there. Yes. So he has heard of it. Okay.
Argument from undesigned coincidences.
Undesigned coincidences. What are undesigned coincidences? Well, this is an argument first put out by William Paley. If you're familiar with the teleological or design argument for the existence of God, this is the guy who gave the story of the watch being discovered in the field, the watchmaker argument. William Paley. But even though he's the first guy to write about it, he's not the guy who became popular for undesigned coincidences. That would have been J.J. Blunt in the 19th century. And so he argued that we can corroborate the biblical documents. He looked at a number of them, including the Old Testament, but specifically we'll be looking at the Gospels. And we can cross-check them. Sometimes an author will leave out details and a natural question will arise, which another gospel fills in, so they fit together almost like puzzle pieces. So let's look at a couple of examples of this. In Mark chapter 1 and Matthew chapter 4, we have the calling of the first disciples, right? A lot of us, when we're little kids, we remember this story, and I will make you fishers of men. Remember that story? So in Mark and Matthew's Gospels, we are told that the disciples were mending their nets. Mending their nets. Okay? Well, that's what fishermen do, right? They've got to, do maintenance on their tools. So what makes this interesting is we're not told why exactly they're mending the nets. But when we read Luke chapter 5, we get more context. We get more details. And in Luke chapter 5, we learn that the disciples, they've been out fishing all night. They've had no luck. And Jesus says, well, you know what? Why don't you go ahead and put your nets out one more time? Right? One more time. They're a little skeptical, but they do it anyway. And what happens? They catch so many fish that their nets break. Their nets break. So what happens is Luke provides that detail, which we don't have in Matthew and Mark. So it, again, leads to the conclusion that Luke has done his homework, right? He's investigated this. He's telling a truthful story, and that detail, the details about the story, corroborate what Matthew and Mark wrote about. Now, this gets a little tricky when you think about what's called the synoptic problem. The synoptic problem pertains to the chronology in which Matthew, Mark, and Luke were written and the relationship to one another. Now, I won't go into the full details here, but what I'd like you to come away with is that some examples of undesigned coincidences don't work depending upon what your belief is about if Mark was the first gospel or if Matthew was the first gospel. Or some might even think Luke, highly unlikely. But some do think Matthew, Luke, Mark. Some do hold that order. So it gets a little weird depending upon your view. But regardless of your position, there are good examples of undesigned coincidences. So even if you held to one particular model of the synoptic problem, the argument is still generally good. I don't think it's great, it's stellar, perfect from all accusations, but I think it's still a good argument overall. So let me give some other examples, and these will be some stronger examples. Let me first give 4 criteria for what makes a good undesigned coincidence. Number 1, that the material is unique material to the gospel, not found somewhere else. Number 2, that the material takes place in different contexts, a different story, a different narrative, but it's a detail that impacts another story. Number 3, there's a natural question that arises. Why were they mending their nets? Sometimes some examples of undesigned coincidences have a forced question. It's not natural. It doesn't feel natural. And so I think that leads to a weaker example of an undesigned coincidence, if it even is sufficient for one. The stronger UCs have a natural question. Number 4, in terms of the criteria, bidirectional or unidirectional. The mending of the nets example is unidirectional, one way, right? From Luke to corroborate Matthew and Mark. Bidirectional are where you have details from different gospels helping each other out. So let's look at an example. Why does Jesus stand up at the moment to wash the disciples' feet in John 13:4? Well, because we told in 22 that they had been bickering about who would be the greatest in the kingdom. So by standing up, he sort of interrupts the bickering, right? So that works both ways. Those are 2 details, not contained anywhere else, but it presents a much coherent picture of what happened. Another example. Why does Jesus teach, I am among you as one who serves? That's from Luke 22:27. Again, Jesus teaches, I am among you as one who serves. Well, because according to John 13:4, he dressed himself up as a servant, not as a king, right? When you have the triumphal entry, he dressed up as a servant. So again, that's a bidirectional. So that, I think, lends to the idea that it's a stronger example. There are some examples that aren't as good, and I have a couple of those if you want examples, but I'd rather have you think on the good examples when we think about the TVA. So let's review. How can we know the Bible is true? The transmission of the text has been faithfully preserved through the centuries. The veracity of the documents speaks of real people in real places doing real things. Wheel of fortune. People, places, things. And the accounts of the eyewitnesses present testimonial evidence of people who saw and lived alongside Jesus and his earliest followers. Now it's time for questions and possible answers. Yes, right here.
One of the biggest points against that scholars like to throw against Luke, I know this because it's on the Wikipedia page for the Gospel of Luke.
Well, how do you know it's scholars then? Continue.
It leads. But people say that there's no evidence of
The census?
the census but I don't care about the census. I more care about the genocide of the
yeah.
children.
Yeah, so if you want a good reference on this, Paul Meyer, retired historian from Western Michigan University, has written, it might be an internet article, but if you Google Paul Meyer, M-A-I-E-R, he has a nice, it could be a little booklet, where he basically presents the view that the genocide against infants was a regional, isolated instruction. Because, so here's the question. What we have with the early infancy narratives of Jesus is that Herod instructs all the baby boys to be killed because he doesn't want to be dethroned as king. And so if Herod knows the general area where the Messiah would have come from, then the instruction to kill the baby boys would have only been pertained to that region. So it could have merely been the case that you had a few towns in which this alleged genocide occurred. And it may have been such a small thing that it wouldn't have been notable to other Greco-Roman historians. And we also know Herod was pretty darn crazy. We can read about the other things that he did. And so it sounds like this is the type of thing he would do, even though we may not have external corroboration for that specific instance. So it may not have been as large as we've made it out to be. Sometimes the stories we learn in Sunday school are simplified, and sometimes the history is a bit more complex. Other questions?
You mentioned that there's over 5,000 manuscripts of the New Testament.
Mm-hmm.
Are those complete?
So no.
Parts?
Yeah, parts. Most of them, so especially the later you get in history, the more likely it is that you have complete copies. But especially, we'll say pre-5th century, a lot of these are just parts. And the earliest complete ones we have, Codex Sinaiticus, Codex Vaticanus, and Codex Alexandrinus. So 4th and 5th century. But thereafter, it becomes more common for there to be full. But even still, you might get some parts here and there. So it's a mixture. And that goes all the way up to the 5th century, because eventually you get the printing press. And so there's no longer hand copying. Other questions? We've got 15 minutes.
Well, so why, what was the philosophical difference in the translators of KJV versus ESV?
Very good. So there are multiple philosophical differences. So one is consider manuscript tradition. Okay, remember those 4 families? And the editors had, we'll say, philosophical preferences. I mean, they had convictions, that's a better word, philosophical convictions over which manuscript tradition to use. And it's not like they just, this is not like I like vanilla and you like chocolate. This is, the convictions were based on what they believed were the strongest, reliable manuscripts. And so the Byzantine family, their argument is sort of tradition. This is church tradition, whereas the Alexandrian family of manuscripts these are the oldest. These are the oldest, and typically, not always, but typically, oldest is best. And so that's a philosophical difference on the manuscripts. Pertaining to the philosophy of how that's brought into the English, you have a spectrum between dynamic equivalence and you might go with something like word for word. Okay? So this is creating like a social equivalence. I was talking to someone in between sessions and was giving this very hypothetical example. Let's say you had an unreached people group that was a matriarchal society, and in their language, they didn't have the word mankind, they had she-kind, okay? So if you wanted to reach that culture, you might choose certain words that are more appropriate to that society, okay? So that goes to the dynamic equivalence. Whereas if you wanted to find words in a society that were closer to the Greek or Hebrew text, you'd be closer to word for word. So some examples here, like the Message, okay? Then you have something like the New Living Translation. Then you have like the NIV. Then you have something like the ESV. And then you have something like the New King James or the KJV. Those would be close to word for word. You have, there might be debate about where NASB fits, but that's closer towards the word for word. So it's a spectrum, and it depends on what you're trying to do. And, this is really important to consider if you're evangelizing people. Let's say you want to give a Bible to someone who was unchurched, doesn't know anything about Christianity, okay? If you give them a KJV, they're going to be like, what? This is like from an alien world, okay? What I recommend people for unchurched, either almost new Christians or new Christians, is the NLT. It's very smooth, very easy to understand. Does it get to all the close details of here? No, but that's not what it's intended to do. So it depends on who or what you're using the scriptures for. So that gets to the question about the philosophy. So you're dealing with manuscript tradition, and you're dealing with sort of philosophical goals. That's why there's a difference. And also these are called, I don't know if I said this, but these are called English editions. So you don't actually say the English Standard Version is a translation. It's an edition. They're all translated into English, but what separates them is that they're different editions.
So wouldn't it be dangerous though if you take the dynamic equivalence, because the further the generations move away, you have the opportunity for the story to be told differently. So i.e., if I sat here and told a short story and let it work around the room back to me, we're gonna end up with something that is not even remotely close.
It's not a problem if you abide by the Alexandrian text type family. It only becomes a problem perhaps if you're doing the Byzantine family. But even then, so you look to the manuscript tradition. So we're not going from Greek into Latin, into German, into English, into that culture, hypothetical culture, she-kind culture. We're going from English, from Greek to English, right? It's direct. So anyone who tells you that you're going through multiple translations, they don't know what they're talking about.
And maybe I need to be a little clearer here. So, and I hear the issue about a different people group getting a dynamic equivalence.
Okay. So your concern is that the more dynamic you get,
Yes.
the further from the original meaning it is.
Yes.
That's a valid concern, and the question is, to what extent should we do that? And that's the debate scholars have, and that's why you have this spectrum. Okay,
So the difficulty with that is that the English language can't actually communicate the meaning.
You do lose meaning. That's right.
And I would
Even in a
submit-
word for word, you lose it.
I would submit that the best way to interpret the Bible is Greek and Hebrew, and we should all be signing up.
Right. So this is so that's a good point you're making, and so it's this. Even this word for word English edition is an interpretation of the original, right? So the only way you can avoid being lost in translation, if you will, is if you learn Hebrew and Greek, and even then you still may be lost because of just the fact that 2,000 years has passed. So that is still a problem, and that's just the problem of language. I mean, even if with contemporary things, it doesn't have to be a document from 2,000 years ago. It could be a contemporary language where you lose it. Yes, the best version is the version a person would actually read. If the problem is people aren't reading their Bibles, what can we do to get them to read? So, yeah. And if you give that newbie a KJV, they're not going to read it. Yeah. Any other questions? We've got 9 minutes. Bob and back.
Yeah, talking about Luke and how accurate he is it not true that at one time people believed Luke didn't know what he was talking about, and as we've studied more about biblical archaeology, he's been proven true time and time again? Is that fair to say that?
Well, depending upon how much you dig, you can find people believing all sorts of things. There are people that think Jesus didn't exist. I actually have conversed with a guy, and he's published journal articles, believe it or not. He argues that Luke didn't exist. What we think of Luke didn't exist, and the author of Luke Acts was a female. And it's just like, well, how do you get that? I mean, it's like there's not even any evidence towards that hypothesis, but he's convicted of it. So yeah, you could dig far deep and come up with all sorts of people believing odd things.
Well, I'll just start in terms of like general scholarship of the concept. For instance, there's going into Jericho, out of Jericho, into Jericho. I think that's in Luke, right? That's part of the story.
Yeah, I think that's right.
And so the people say, well, obviously Luke wasn't accurate here, and then they found basically different areas of different parts of the city or different cities there. So so biblical archaeology has shown a lot to be true.
So biblical archaeology has been kind to evangelical Christianity, so much so that not a single archaeological discovery has disputed what the biblical text says about that time, place in the world. Not a single archaeological discovery, which is fascinating. Yes, sorry, I didn't see you.
I've heard it said that, way back when, I don't even know when to say it was, but that the pottery, and it was so scarce that there were times where it would be washed over so it could be used again.
Yes.
Has that ever been found?
Oh, absolutely. Let me give you a fascinating example. So, I've had a nice relationship with Bart Ehrman. I formed it really when I invited him to come to a Christian conference. It was the first time he spoke at a Christian event in over 30 years. The last time was when he was an evangelical Christian. It was very well received, but I've had a nice relationship with him. But a few years ago, he wrote a Facebook post about this mummy mask that was discovered. And there were certain tests done on the mummy mask, and we discovered biblical text on the mummy mask. So it was clearly reused material, and so we discovered this Bible verse. You would think a New Testament scholar would be enamored with the fact that we found another manuscript, fairly early dating. I can't remember what century it's from, but we're talking probably 3rd, 4th, 5th century maybe. And you would think the New Testament scholar would appreciate that, but you know what his post was about? How dare we disturb the dead and the things which honor them. So he was annoyed, we might say, with the fact that we were messing with a mummy mask. And so I thought that was very telling of his position, because if I were a New Testament scholar, I'd want to know all there is to know about the New Testament. And instead, he sort of had a different take. So yes, we have archaeological evidence of things being washed over, repurposed, reused. And so that's why some of the best manuscripts we have come from garbage dumps, because people threw things away. So, I'm not recommending you go dumpster diving, okay? But it really is fascinating that when we search the Middle East, those are the best spots to find what people were like. We know the things that they used, the garbage, the things they threw away. So that's, the best resources that archaeologists have found. One or two more questions, and before we get to that, if you want to follow my work, classic Midwestern ope. I said ope. You guys say ope here? No. Okay. You're not going to someone and start ope. Sorry. That's not a thing here. That just left. Okay, if you want to follow my work, I'm on Facebook, Twitter, YouTube. Also, I put Apologetics 315. Apologetics 315 is an apologetics aggregate website. It takes resources and material from a variety of apologists. I have a video channel there, so you can subscribe. The reason why I've done that is because I don't know how long I'll be on YouTube. I've got a video series coming out on abortion, and in July they announced that they were going to be monitoring videos for disinformation. So I don't trust the tech giants. So Apologetics 315 is a Christian apologetics aggregate site, including video channels. So go ahead and subscribe to me there so you can catch all my videos. Also on the handout, there's a QR code if you want to sign up for my quarterly newsletter. So you can do it straight from your phone, or you can visit me at the table afterward. Any other questions? Yes?
In Luke and Acts, he starts off like most excellent.
Theophilus.
Was he like a lawyer or something?
There's a debate over whether Theophilus was a real person or not. Translated, Theophilus means friend of God, Theos, God, right? Theophilus. So it could be the case that Luke is simply writing to the reader, that Theophilus is anyone who's reading his work. Whoever is reading his work is a friend of God. So there's a view like that. There are others who say, no, Theophilus was a real person. But I don't know that we can know with certainty.
There's this one book series I like, and it's like historical fantasy fiction, but it's Christian. And
Is it called Chronicles of Narnia?
But it's like whatever gaps are there, she tries to fill it in with like plausible things, and like with Theophilus, he would be like a Roman lawyer for Paul, and so that's why we made it all orderly and stuff, because he had to kind of win him over and be able to, so that he could put the case forward, like knowing all the facts and everything.
Right, so part of the debates, those who think Theophilus was historical, was that because Luke was a travel companion of Paul, and Paul gave these arguments in the court of law to defend himself, Luke did his homework in order to help Paul and his predicament. And so perhaps it's the case that Luke wrote this for a lawyer. That is a position of some scholars. But again, it's just one of those things we don't have enough evidence for. I'd love it if someday we discovered like the letter to the Laodiceans, which we're told about. If it were proven authentic, that would be super cool, and we'd be like, oh yeah, regarding these things, this is what I actually meant, or this, so we'd have some things cleared up. But until then, we're left with what we have.
So I have a quick question on the authenticity of stuff. So, what do they kind of base off of? Like, the Apocrypha stuff and the Book of Enoch, how do they, like, okay, this isn't biblical.
Good question. So we need to distinguish between Old Testament Apocrypha and New Testament Apocrypha. Old Testament Apocrypha, we see Paul quotes from, and Jude quotes from the book of Enoch. So, great, thank you. Yeah. We do see that there are these books out there. Now, whether they were considered divinely inspired by Paul, for example, we don't know. In terms of the early church, again, the evidence is limited in terms of just precisely what they believed about these documents, because even the early church fathers, they quote from other sources, so we don't know exactly what they believed about them. With regard to the New Testament Apocrypha, things are a lot clearer. So, for example, the Gospel of Peter, the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Mary, the Gospel of Philip, all these things, these are materials which are quite legendary, and they date from the 2nd and 3rd century. And so if we're looking for accounts of eyewitnesses or people who knew the eyewitnesses, then those do not qualify. And the church fathers knew that. They knew that these documents are fabrications, fictionalized legendary takes on Jesus. And that's why they weren't accepted. So that's a lot clearer for us. But I would encourage folks, us Protestants, to read the Old Testament Apocrypha. It provides a broader background and context. We don't have to embrace them as being divinely inspired, but we can still learn from them. And then in terms of the New Testament, I really want to encourage people to read the Didache, the teachings of the apostles. You can learn a lot about the early church and their instructions and how they had a worship service. Very fascinating if you want to learn more about the early church. Thank you all for coming. Great to see so many faces.